the deal. As the teaching pastor, I deal a lot with words. I write a lot with the team on the messages and the sermons, and I just love new words. I love turn of phrases. I love studying the etymology of words, and I love just adding words to my vocabulary for the hope that one day I get to use them. And so I want to give you guys a word this morning. The word is qualia. 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 Now here's the deal. If you play Scrabble or Words with Friends, you want to write this down, okay? Because that's a Q word. That's worth a lot of points. Qualia. Here's what qualia is. Qualia is the word to describe that which cannot be described by words. Qualia. Let me help you wrap your head around it. Basically, there's things that you cannot describe them. It's impossible to describe. And usually qualia is subscribed to things like color. Think about it. If you were talking with someone, how would you describe green? It's green. I mean, the only way to convey an understanding, a mutual understanding of color is to look at it and look at it, and you know that it's green, and to have them look at it and to just tell them what you're experiencing is, we call that green. That's the only way to describe it. I mean, you couldn't verbalize it, right? Now here's what's crazy, because then, well, how do I know that? How do I know what you're experiencing is what I'm experiencing is the exact same color? Because if you may be colorblind, your rods or cones may be firing differently. So I see this as green, and I've labeled this as green, and I tell you this is green. But if you see it as gray, then you live your whole life thinking that gray is green, and, right? It's qualia. Or taste. A lot of times things of taste are qualia, right? Like how would you describe chocolate to someone? It's sweet and chocolatey? like how would you describe it? I mean, there's no way to describe it. I mean, if it was white chocolate, that would be easy. It's gross, right? Don't eat that. But seriously, how would you verbalize just unwrapping the perfect piece of milk chocolate, putting it on your tongue and letting it just melt in your cheeks? Like, you can't describe it. You just have to say, just eat this. And see how awesome it is. We call that chocolate. Now, I say all that because that's exactly what I'm stuck with here. As a communicator, as a pastor, we're in the middle of this series called Grace Period, but that is what we're doing. Grace is a qualia. I mean, I could give you metaphors and similes. I can talk with you about grace over and over again, but truly, unless you experience it, you don't even fully understand the magnitude of it. Because here's the thing, grace was never meant to be a definition word. It was never meant to be, something that can be described. Like, grace has to be experienced. And I could tell you about my experience with God. I could tell you about my experience with grace. And I could say, have you ever had an experience like that in your life? And I could say, well, when you have that experience, we call that grace. But I don't know that your experience is truly what I have experienced. And so that's kind of where we are. Each and every one of us, our understanding of the grace of God is dependent upon our experiences. And our experiences are shaped by our circumstances. Think about that. Every time, if it's a good experience, a bad experience, a happy experience, a sad experience, all of your experiences are usually shaped by your circumstances. It's interesting, the word circumstance in the etymology has the same root as the word circumference. Because that's what the circumstance is, right? It's that which surrounds you. It's your world. It's your experience. That is the circumference of your influence. And here's the thing, and here's the issue. What happens when we have bad circumstances? What is your understanding of God's love, His sovereignty, His power, His grace in the midst of a bad circumstance? A circumstance that you didn't ask for, you don't want, that you never would wished upon someone else, but yet you find yourself in the midst of and cannot change. For a lot of people, that is a point in their faith where they find themselves having a significant problem with the understanding of God's grace. And here's what's interesting is all of us have had that. Every single one of us, at some point in your life, you find yourself in a circumstance that you do not like and you cannot change. For some, that happened very early in life. You were born into a family, you were born into a situation that you did not ask to be a part of, you did not sign up for, but this was now your reality. And for the time that you lived in that household, for the time that you lived around those people, you could not change your circumstance. And for some of you, that's left a huge scar in your understanding of God's grace. And that's a hindrance for you. Maybe for you, maybe the circumstance was school. It's interesting, right? School is the first place you go where people don't have to like you, right? School is the place where you go and you first start to find out where you stack up. You walk into school and all of a sudden you start to see the students start to segregate, and you know who are the popular kids and the not popular kids, the smart kids and the not so smart kids, the athletes and the awkwards, and you start to realize, oh, this is where I am, and I don't like that circumstance. And I don't know for you if it was elementary school, middle school, high school, college, but at some point you probably found yourself in a circumstance that you did not want. For a lot of people, it's after school, right? When you start to get into the real world and you start to get your job and your career lined up, and you thought you were going to make this level of income, but you find out you can only provide this level of income, and now all of a sudden the type of home that you can live in, the places where you can go, a vacation or not vacation, the types of food that you can eat, the things that you can afford, provide for your family, that circumstance may not be what you wanted it to be, but yet it's your reality now and you cannot change it. So what do we do when we find ourselves in these moments? Because here's what happens. Left to ourselves and left to our own kind of reasoning, logic, our understanding, we start to play this kind of if-then scenario with God. I mean, maybe you come to church, maybe you start going to church, you're starting to find a relationship with God. And what we tend to do, what logically makes sense is we say these if-then kind of statements. God, if you will make my circumstances great, God, if you will make my experiences good, then I will believe that you are good and I will give my life to you. But that only happens if you make my life good, if you make my circumstances pleasant. And we've all kind of fallen into that trap, right? I mean, think about your prayer life. Think about the types of prayers you pray. How many of them are about you and your circumstance? You know, God, help me, to find that right person. God, help me to, help us have a child right now. God, help my husband learn to do this, my wife learn to do that. God, help my neighbors move because I can't stand them. God, help me get this job, get that place, get this grade. Think about, we're constantly asking God to help in our circumstances. Now, here's the question. What happens when that doesn't come to fruition immediately? What is your understanding of God's sovereignty, love? What is your understanding of God's grace? Because when it comes to faith, that is a dangerous place to be if that's your perspective. You are putting yourself on shaky ground if that is your reality. The Apostle Paul talks about this. If you have a Bible or Bible app, you turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. We'll put it on the screen. But Paul says these words, and it's interesting how he says this. Writing to the church in Thessalonica and trying to encourage them, he tells them this: rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Really? Give thanks in all circumstances? Every circumstance, Because here's the deal. I read that and I'm just like, what? Because I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I wasn't raised going to church. I wasn't raised with flannel graph stories. And I didn't know who all these people were in the Bible when I first started to hear people talk about the Bible and preach the Bible, and I first started to read it myself. And so I remember being a young adult hearing this verse quoted in a sermon, and Paul says, give thanks in all circumstances. And I'm like, you are out of your mind. Because Paul, you don't know what it's like to be in the real world. Paul, you don't know what my circumstances are. Right? Here's Paul. He's probably some fancy preacher man who loves God and his life's always perfect, has a silver spoon in his mouth, and he's like, and you need to give thanks in all circumstances. Walk a mile in my shoes, Paul, and try to be thankful. And that's where I was at in that season of my life. And but what I found out as I actually started to read the rest of the Bible is I didn't know Paul. Because when you hear about Paul's life, when you hear what Paul's circumstances were, that verse has much more significance. In fact, it's in 2 Corinthians that Paul kind of lists some of the things that are his reality, some of the things that were his experience, some of the things that were his circumstance in his life. He says this, 2 Corinthians, it's in chapter 11. Verse 24 is where it picks up. It says this, 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Understand, this is the most... the highest level of corporal punishment that a person could get. You remember like back in the 90s, that kid who like spray painted something in Singapore and got whipped and everybody lost their mind, you know? Like that's kind of what's happening. In fact, the Jewish people said that you can only whip someone 39 times because if you do 40 or more, we're afraid we're going to kill them. And we don't want them to die. We just want them to be in agony. Paul says, I received that 5 different occasions. Look what he says. He goes on and says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. You get the idea that that wasn't like a formal corporal punishment. That was more like a lynch mob, just grabbing sticks, angry at him for whatever he was saying, whatever he was preaching, and going after him and beating him with sticks. It says, I was pelted with stones. Don't get that wrong. We're not talking about pebbles and we're not talking about rocks. We're talking about stones. The act of stoning was a type of punishment that was meant to kill. In fact, when you read Paul's account of his stoning earlier in Scripture, you see that, in fact, the people throwing the rocks at him thought he was dead, and that's the only reason they stopped. He goes on, says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. I probably would stop getting on boats at that point. He says, I spent a night and a day in the open sea. He says, I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, and in danger from Gentiles. I've been in danger in the city and in the country. I've been in danger at the sea. I've been in danger from false believers. Basically, everybody hates him at some point in his life. He says, I have labored and toiled. I have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger. I have known thirst. I have gone without food. I have been cold and naked. And I don't know about you, but I read that list and I think about enduring any of that, one of those. And then I hear Paul say, and give thanks in all circumstances. And I'm a little humbled. Because I had a neighbor whose dog took a dookie on my lawn, and that ruined my day. And when I interacted with them, I wasn't Christ-like, and I wasn't loving, and I didn't offer grace because he grieved me in some great way. You see, that's what we're talking about here. The reason so many Christ followers are unable to give grace, the reason so many Christ followers are unable to experience grace is because we are only focused on our circumstances, our experience, and our view is so narrow that even when as a pastor I'm saying God offers you grace, then we look at that and go, oh, that's nice, but the grace that you're saying, oh, it's nice, that's not the same grace that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a grace that is so huge. I'm talking about a grace that is so profound. I'm talking about a grace that covers over every grievance, over every sin, over every heartache, over everything. A grace that will ultimately make your life perfect in fulfillment in Christ Jesus. And I can't even say it in a way to assure that you understand it. So I'm stuck with just metaphors. But here's the thing. A metaphor is not going to be enough. You have to, at some point, trust God. You have to, at some point, lay it down to God. At some point, you have to reveal your hurts, your pain. At some point, you have to invite God into your circumstance and to change your perspective of your life. At some point, you'd have to take that step. I cannot take it for you. I think of grace like this. Think about a scale. I think we have a picture of a scale. We'll put it on the screen. We're familiar with this, right? The scales of justice. You're very familiar with that, the functionality of scales. You put something on one side, it weighs it down. Imagine this. In your mind's eye or on that screen, I want you to look at that left side of the scale. Here's what I want you to do. Whatever your circumstance is, I want you to place it on that scale. Whatever sickness you've endured in your life, whatever neglect, whatever pain, abandonment, whatever financial struggles, I want you to start to lay those on that scale. And you'll see it lowers, right? It lowers and lowers and lowers. I mean, now I want you to also take your sin. Take your sin, that which you know of yourself that you don't, your spouse doesn't know, I don't know, but that what you know is absolutely true of you, that you were absolutely tempted by, that you absolutely do day in and day out. I want you to take that and start putting that on there as well. Put your lust on there. Put your anger, your rage on there. Put your greed and your selfishness on there. Now here's the thing. I don't know what your circumstances are. I don't know what your sins are. And probably yours are as different as there are people in this room. But what I know is absolutely true of every single one of us in this room is that left side of the scale is pinned to the floor. Every single one of us could fill that up. And this is how grace works. This is what grace is. Grace is that which pours out from God on the other side of that scale. And it never stops pouring. It is given anew daily. It is always pouring out from God. And as the grace of God fills up the other side of the scale, however heavy, however weighted, however much is on that left side is now lifted high. And God says, I will not let you falter, and I will not ever stop giving you my grace. That is what it does in our lives. I love the way Paul writes this. Again, it's in that same letter to the church in Corinth, the 2 Corinthians. It's in the same letter that he talks about his shipwreck, his pain, his circumstances in his life. In that exact same letter, Paul says this in verse 16 of chapter 4. He says, therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, outwardly we are pinned to the ground, outwardly our circumstances look insurmountable. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. That's the step. That's the only way to fully understand what I'm talking about when I say grace. You have to not focus on what is seen. You have to experience what is unseen. You have to change your perspective from just your circumference, from your circumstances. You have to change your perspective to see it from God's perspective. And it's hard. And it means that you have to lay some things down. I mean, at some point we have to start taking these steps. We have to stop looking at our lives from just our limited perspective and truly try to embrace God's. And that means that you're going to have to open his word. That means you have to understand what's going on in his life. That means you have to read about the people who before us have given their life to God, who have been in so much pain and turmoil, the people who've already lost their lives. And then read how ultimately God still redeemed them. God still restored them. God still brought them into his presence in heaven. And that assurance, that promise, that salvation is available for us. We have to start seeing things from God's perspectives. We have to stop living for temporary things. You are not just a body and flesh and blood. You are spirit and soul. You were made to be eternal, and we will have an eternal resting place. We have to start seeing that in us, because that's what God sees. We have to stop the pity. And I say that, and I'm not trying to be flippant, and I'm not trying to downplay anybody's pain. Believe me, I know heartache, and I know circumstances that are tragic. But at some point, that can no longer define us. We have to get past our past. And at some point, we have to realize that there is a purpose, and that God is faithful, and that we don't have to live in fear, but we can know that God will faithfully work things out for the good of those who love Him, and we have to start living by that perspective. And when you do that, and as you take those steps, as you open this word, as you start to live that out, you start to see that God's grace is greater than any circumstance. And you start to live on a stable ground of faith. Again, all I have are metaphors, but I was thinking about it, and for me, it's like the open waters, right? 2 occasions in my life, I've had the opportunity to go out into the ocean on ships. In high school, I was in junior ROTC, and we went out on a Navy AOE, it's like a supplier ship, and we went out for a week into the open sea. When I got married, my wife and I, we took a cruise, and we went out into the open sea. Now here's the thing, and many of you have had this experience. You've been on a ship, a cruise ship, whatever, into the open sea, and you know that ship is huge. And when you're on it, you don't think a whole lot about the water. You don't think a whole lot about the waves. You're not aware of where the waves are coming from and what angle they're at. You're not really too concerned with the ship. In fact, all you kind of feel is just maybe just a little bit of like a this, right? But I'm telling you, I was on that cruise ship, and I played basketball on that cruise ship. I went ice skating on the cruise ship. I played putt-putt. You were not really concerned too much with the water around you because the ship was so huge and it was so stable. Now, I've also, and unfortunately, been in the open waters on a boat. And I don't know if you've had this experience. I don't know if you've gone out, not just in the middle of just like a lake, but like a great lake or an open sea. I don't know if you've been out in waves in a boat. It is horrifying. You are well aware of each and every wave that is coming your way. You are well aware of the angle and that you're turning into them and that you're make sure that they break the right way. You are well aware of the movement of that boat that is not subtle. You are sick to your stomach, getting sick over the edge, right? You are just living in peril with each and every wave that's coming towards you. And that's exactly the difference of understanding God's grace. That's exactly the difference of focusing your perspective on His circumstances and not just your circumstances. You see, when our perspective is just our life, just day in and day out, and we have no eternal perspective, we have none of God's perspective, then everything tosses and turns us. Everything that comes our way, every hardship, every pain, it just wrecks our whole life. And we live a life that's so full of anxiety, and a life where we're sick to our stomachs, and a life where we're just, at any moment we can just go overboard and explode on people and be so angry and rage. That's how many of us live our lives because it's just about us. But when you start to see things from God's perspective, when you start to see your circumstances in God's story, then you start to realize that even in the little things, those waves don't affect you the same. Because God's grace is huge. His love is huge. And you are on steady ground with Him.